Global. Leading Britain's conversation with Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Ring Rees-Mogg. Put your calls to Jacob Rees-Mogg now. 0345 6060 973. This is LBC.
Yes, it's Ring Rees-Mogg with Jacob Rees-Mogg here, and of course with me, Nick Ferrari. Now, much has happened since I last had the pleasure of sharing a studio with Jacob Rees-Mogg, perhaps the most significant of which is that England have triumphed in a test series against India, which we might discuss a minute or two, and I see Mr. Rees-Mogg smiling because I'm a cricket fan, but he's an even greater fan than I am. But first we must look probably at more serious matters. Jacob Rees-Mogg, if I was to either promote or demote you to the position of a doctor, and I ask you to study the position of the patient in front of you, which is the Chequers Accord or the Chequers Deal, how would you pronounce on his or her health?
I think the pulse is very faint. The mirror being held above the mouth to see if there's any breath coming out is not showing much happening, not much in the way of breath coming forth. The question is, can it be revived? So far, it's not popular with pro-Europeans, it's not popular with the European Commission, and Eurosceptics think it's not Brexit, so it doesn't have many supporters.
Can it be reworked?
I don't think so. I think Brexit is a fundamental error. I think it's trying to do the wrong thing.
Brexit is a fundamental error, you've just said, Mr.
Chequers is a fundamental error.
You said
No, Chequers is a fundamental error.
I'm sure you did say that. That's my job.
Chequers is a fundamental error because it's not trying to work out what the European Union will accept, nor is it trying to work out what Brexit is supposed to mean. It wants to leave us half in and half out. And Theresa May was quite clear at Lancaster House that she didn't want that. So it's a retreat from that position. But also the EU, and particularly Monsieur Barnier, has been very clear that you can't cherry-pick. You can't have the bits of the EU that you want and not the bits that you don't want, because that undermines the whole principle of the European Union.
We'll come to questions in a moment. Julia, you're up first. But where does this leave your leader and Prime Minister, Mr. Rees-Mogg?
Well, the Prime Minister has shown an ability to change her mind in the past, and I'm sure she can show an ability to change her mind in the future.
What if she doesn't?
Well, I think it would be very difficult to get Chequers agreed at the European Union level, and even harder to get it through the House of Commons. There comes a point at which the flogging of a dead donkey has to stop.
How did you find your meeting with Michel Barnier?
Extremely interesting.
Had you met before?
No.
Just for some background. So this was the first time you two gentlemen had met?
That's right. We'd never met before, and I think what I learned from the meeting was that the European Union's position is both clear and perfectly reasonable. That is to say, the EU recognises that we are leaving, though is sad about it, wishes we weren't. The EU thinks, therefore, we will be a third country and can have the same deal as other third countries have. Can have a very good one because of our closeness as a neighbour and because they've done deals with other people, so the path is now better trodden than it was when deals were done with countries like South Korea. And then there are some issues that need to be resolved that would make that easier and smoother. And so I think if you look at what the European Union is asking for from us, it is that we should say, OK, let's deal on a free trade basis, let's look at what Canada's done, let's build on that, and work out with you what the solution is to the Irish border problem.
And lastly, before we come to that call, how's your negotiations, your deals going with Monsieur Barnier with a rival plan that I read in one of the newspapers this morning, to the Chequers plan?
Well, I think the rival plan is a Canada Plus plan. I don't think this
you
is
discussed that with Michel.
I don't think this is any great secret. No, he made it clear that a Canada Plus deal was available to the United Kingdom. But he's made that clear many times before. And the meeting that I had as part of the Brexit Select Committee, because it wasn't a private meeting, that will have a transcript made available so everyone will know precisely what was discussed.
So you weren't ganging up on Mrs May, as one of the papers suggests here?
Oh, how would I gang up on my own Prime Minister?
Let's go to those calls. Julia is in Carmarthenshire. Julia, you're on the radio and you're through to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Do go ahead. Good morning.
Oh, good morning. Oh, hello.
Morning.
I was just wanting to say, ask your opinion, really, about the debate in this country after Brexit, and how binary I feel and divisive the argument has become. I am a bedridden person. I've been bedridden for 3 years, and I rely on our NHS and my lovely nurses to help me with blood tests, etc. But I had a very personal experience of the argument when I had a nurse come in yesterday to give me a blood test. She is a lovely nurse. She helps me. I asked her as a patient, what will happen if there is no Brexit, if there is a no-deal Brexit next year? And in sort of a professional opinion, she just said, oh, we've survived before, we'll survive again. It's all Project Fear. And that really upset me. I had a person in my bedroom giving me political opinions when I wanted a professional answer, someone who I liked and respected. And I feel the polarisation of the debate in this country is going to take years. And it really makes me sad.
And so to sum that up in a direct question to me, Rees-Mogg, in a sentence, if you would, Julie, what would that question be? How do we get over the division? Is that what we're driving at?
Well, I'd like to say, I mean, how does he feel he is helping in the divisive arguments? What do you feel we can do to heal the country?
Mr. Rees-Mogg.
Julia, I think that's a very important point, and I think there has been more political division over this issue than over other recent issues. It's not unprecedented in British history, but it is a particularly divisive issue. And I think the talk of a second referendum would be even more divisive. I think if we're divided now, a second referendum would really split the country in two. I think the answer is that we need to have Brexit delivered, that there is much more division before something is done than after it has been accomplished. And that when we get to April 2019, or at the end of the transition period, when we have finally left, and we discover that actually the NHS is continuing to be free to import medicines from the rest of the world as it is now, and that it hasn't made any change, and that these scare stories are simply wrong, as so far they have been. I mean, all the scare stories so far have been discredited. When we get to that stage, the country will begin to come together again.
Stockpiling medicine, though, you mentioned that within the NHS, and I'm sure that was something that interests Julia from her condition.
I think it's an extraordinary thing to have announced that we will have control over imports into this country. We may not be able to tell other countries how they receive our exports, but what comes into us is under our control. And why would we make it more difficult to bring things into this country?
We won't be stockpiling medicines, you don't
Well,
think?
the government is suggesting 6 weeks of stockpiling. Some stockpiling is routine. But I think stockpiling and looking at it in that way is part of a scare tactic, because importing is under British governmental control.
OK, quick response from you, Julia.
Thanks.
All right, that's a quick response. Paul, we're staying in the area. Paul is in Brecon. Paul, you're on the radio. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
Morning, Paul.
Morning. Given that Mark Carney yesterday agreed that should you be PM or Boris be PM, he'd work under you as a technocrat, would you be... This is the first part of the question, it's a two-part question. Would you be willing to work under him?
And your second part?
My second part is, given the Canada Plus deal is obviously the most logical way out of this, and that everyone's been doing modelling, I have not heard of any model based on Canada Plus and the normal rollover we get from the external EU deals that we get rolled over to us, even with individualisation down the road. You know, has any modelling been done on that? Because that seems very sensible. And by the way, the Canada Plus doesn't seem to give a problem for Northern Ireland, according to WTO, because they've got a 10-year period where we can trade with our old bloc in a different manner under WTO conditions.
Modelling in a moment. First, your reaction to Mark Carney going and whether he could serve under you or Boris Johnson or whatever might happen.
Well, Paul, I don't think Mark Carney's term of office should be extended. I think playing ducks and drakes with the period of office as Governor of the Bank of England is rather demeaning. That Mr. Carney was meant to serve 8 years. That's the statutory provision. He said for family reasons he couldn't do that.
Which the country accepted, or the
Which the country accepted. Country accepted. He said he'd do 5 years, one term, 5 years. This is the second time he's extended it, and I simply don't think that's a serious way of treating the Bank of England. It is meant to be a one-term fixed period of office, and it's now been fiddled around with twice.
Is it fair to say you're not a signed-up fan, though, of Mr. Carney?
Oh, that's absolutely fair. I think he is not a technocrat, but a deeply politicised governor. And if you have an independent Bank of England, it must not be politically party-pre. and he has been politically party-pree over the Brexit issue.
But you're a successful financial businessman as well. What would it do to the pound? What would it do to the currency? What would it do to the confidence of the city if we were, I appreciate not trading them, but we had to go through another governor of the Bank of England? Exactly what we don't need at this time, isn't it?
Well, there are many able people who would be good governors of the Bank of England. And
of whom do you speak?
They'd be appointed for an 8-year period. Well, Mr. Bailey, Andrew Bailey, is a very credible candidate. If you wanted to be a bit braver, you go for Andrew Tyree, who used to be chairman of the Treasury Select Committee. He'd be a brilliant governor of the Bank of England. Highly intelligent man.
Are they?
No.
They're not?
No. Andrew
Is
Tyree,
Andrew not?
Certainly not. No, strong Remainer. But both of these people could do it in an apolitical way and would not lead to any particular currency turbulence, because these appointments are meant to be routine. What is happening with Mr. Carney extending his role is making it less routine and more uncertain. So, in answer, Paul, to your direct question,
yes.
I think
he should go.
He should go.
He should honour his contract.
He should honour his contract.
Okay, and the modelling as regards of Canada Plus. Are you aware of any modelling?
Modelling is bound to have been done, Paul. It's done on absolutely everything. But I'd caveat that with another good candidate for Governor of the Bank of England, Andy Haldane, who made an excellent speech a couple of years ago trying to explain why economic modelling was almost always wrong. And it's very well worth looking at that. To paraphrase him, because it's a very good and thorough speech, so it's slightly unfair to paraphrase him, he said that modelling is particularly bad at getting inflection points right, and therefore when there's a fundamental change, it's the hardest time for models to work, and therefore all the effort that's been put into modelling on different types of Brexit is not going to come out with the right answer.
Paul, thank you. Paul, on that call, mentioned the issue with the Northern Ireland border. Mr. Rees-Mogg, are we any closer to any form of resolution there?
Well, I think there are two aspects to the Northern Ireland border. One is, what would we do in a no-deal WTO scenario? If we leave on WTO terms, which is nothing to be afraid of and is how we trade with most of the world, and indeed how most trade deals are based, then we would be able to do nothing about the border. We would be able to say, we're not imposing a border, what are you going to do? And leave it up to the EU. In an effort to come to an agreement with the EU, on the other hand, on a Canada Plus style deal, we need to be a bit more imaginative and try and work out what would the EU accept on the Irish border that would be good enough for them to, as Mr. Barnier put it, maintain the integrity of the single market. And there is a big advantage in getting the free trade deal, because it's been made clear that that would be zero tariffs and zero quotas. So all you're concerned about is the matter of standards. You're not concerned about collecting revenue and country of origin issues. And the question is, can you do that jointly with the Irish in other ways? Can you enforce standards on goods exported to the European Union under UK domestic law, whilst leaving us free to produce goods or import goods from the rest of the world under our own standards? And that's where I think the answer comes, to try and help the EU deal with the problem that it has.
We move to other callers. June in Lowestoft. June, you're on the radio. Go ahead. Good morning.
Good morning, Nicky, and good morning, sir. It's an honour to speak with you.
Oh, well, June, thank you so much for calling.
What's your question, June?
My question is, what is your view reference to Scallop Wars, the French fishermen bullying our fishermen, and where is our government and our Royal Navy? And do you think Theresa May will surrender to the French?
Well, I think, though, this is very important. We have to get a sense of proportion, and we don't want to start sending gunboats into French territorial waters. That this is an interesting clash of domestic and EU regulation, and I think it's a very good reason why individual nations should be in charge of their own territorial waters, not the EU, because the EU has dished out quota to British fishermen, which they're trying to use. The French closed their waters to their own fishermen for a period of the year to allow stocks to build up. And actually, I think the French ought to be allowed to regulate their own waters, and the British should be allowed to regulate their own waters, which of course we'll be able to do once we've left the European Union. And at that point, we won't have rights in French waters either. It will be a quid pro quo.
Won't we go back to Cod Wars days?
No, we won't go back to Cod War days because we will agree what quotas we allow EU boats to have when they come in.
What we have tried to do here, though, that hasn't worked off Normandy.
No, what has happened here is that EU regulation that applies to all EU boats allows fishing, and French regulation, which only applies to French boats, stops it. And so you've got a contradiction, and it seems to me the right authority is the French, not the European Union, and the European Union should be taken out of this. And that if it were happening the other way round, I think our fishermen would be very disgruntled if the British government had stopped them fishing, but other nations' fishing fleets were allowed to come in. I think the EU has got us into this muddle.
June, you're in Lowestoft, one of the hearts, really, one of the key parts of the fishing industry. How do you react to what you've heard briefly?
Well, Jacob, at the end of the day, we can't catch any of our fish at the moment. Do you think, Jacob, that Theresa May will trade the fishing industry away to get a better deal with Europe?
I hope not. I think it would be a deep disgrace if she did. It was very disappointing that in the transition deal fishing wasn't preserved. I think that was an error. I think it's unfair on British fishermen who have suffered particularly badly from our membership of the European Union, and therefore I think there's a strong duty to ensure that they benefit as quickly as possible as we leave.
Yeah, so you hope she doesn't, but you can't rule it out, Mr. Rees-Mogg.
I can't rule it out because, as you've seen with Chequers, the Prime Minister has been willing to rub out quite a lot of her red lines so far, so we'll have to wait and see. There are no blank cheques, I fear.
She got a future, the Prime Minister?
Yeah, of course the Prime Minister's got a future.
Really?
Yeah.
Is no Theresa May better than a bad Theresa May?
Well, fortunately, we have a good and marvellous and wonderful Theresa May.
Even with Chequers?
Well, look, I disagree with her on a policy, a major area of policy, but that doesn't mean that I don't think she doesn't have great strengths as a leader.
Yeah, some are suggesting that the cabinet meeting this month could be her denouement.
French word coming in. So we're being very European here.
Yeah.
I don't see why it should be.
That's Andrew Bridgen is suggesting that, of course, the Conservative.
I think that Chequers needs to be got rid of, chucked in the vogue phrase, because nobody wants it, and it doesn't work from a British point of view.
So we need to hear that next week from the Prime Minister.
Well, I think the Prime Minister should recognise that. I think the idea that suddenly what was so interesting about Monsieur Barnier was that he was so clear in his opposition. It was very hard to see what wriggle room he left himself to say, actually, after all, Chequers is acceptable. He said that the customs proposals, the facilitated customs arrangement, and the single rule book was simply unacceptable in terms of EU law. That's quite hard to find a way of saying, well, I didn't really mean that. I mean, you have to be in top form as a dissembler to be able to turn that into Chequers is really rather marvellous.
June, thank you. Paul in Greenwich. Paul, you're on the radio. What's your question? Good morning.
Yes, my question is just a very simple one. I'm just trying to find out whether is Boris delivering the correct Brexit?
It's a bad line. Boris, did you say Boris, Paul? Sorry.
Yes, it's Boris Brexit, the alternative to what PM is putting forward.
Is Boris be put in power? OK, this is an LBC poll of which you might or might not have had sight, Mr Rees-Mogg. People who voted for Brexit would be happy to leave the EU, even if it means food and travel prices would rocket and the UK went into a minor recession. They also supported Boris Johnson more than Theresa May as the politician to deliver a, quotes, real Brexit. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Well, 2 years ago in the Conservative Party leadership campaign, I supported Boris Johnson because I thought he would deliver Brexit extraordinarily well. I haven't seen anything that would cause me to change my mind on that. I think that had he become Prime Minister, we would have negotiated from a greater position of strength and would be heading towards a clearer, cleaner Brexit rather than the muddle of Chequers. So I have the highest regard for Boris Johnson, but there is no vacancy. And
were there to be a vacancy?
But there isn't.
But were there to be?
Well, look, I think Boris is absolutely first class, but there is no vacancy.
Yes. Has he been in contact with you recently?
Well, I mean, I know Boris slightly, but I don't know him enormously well.
Yes. Has Sir Linton Crosby, the election guru, been in contact with you?
Sir Linton has not been. I've only met Sir Linton twice, I think.
In your entire life?
In my entire life. And I think he's a very great man.
Yes.
One of the finest political gurus that you could find, but I don't know him.
You're not part of his happy band?
You happy band of pilgrims, if onward ye with tread. I can't remember how it continues. It's a great hymn, but never mind.
Returning to Mr. Johnson, I imagine that, of course, you turned to the Times first in the morning, but had you turned to the Daily Telegraph on Monday, you'd have seen Mr. Johnson's column there talking about the UK lying flat on the canvas in negotiations with Brussels. The Prime Minister had not even tried to play hardball. The greatest tragedy that we not even tried to get a proper Brexit. Jacob Rees-Mogg?
Yeah, I couldn't put it better myself.
You should perhaps take up writing columns. Why doesn't the Times hire you?
Well, somebody commissions me.
There we go. Chris is in Richmond. Chris, you're on the radio. Go ahead. Good morning.
Morning, Jacob. Nick.
Good morning,
Hello,
Chris.
sir.
If you're so convinced, Jacob, that you were right about us leaving the European Union in 2016, why are you so afraid of the idea of a people's vote on the final deal and the possibility of an exit from Brexit?
Are you afraid, Mr. Rees-Mogg?
No, I'm not afraid at all. I just think it's a singularly silly idea. We've already had 3 votes on this. We had a vote in 2015, the general election, as to whether or not there should be a referendum. We then had the referendum itself, and we then had a general election where over 80% of people voted for parties committed to leaving. The only people calling for a second referendum are people who don't like the result and want it changed and don't recognise the democratic will of the British people.
Not quite the people's vote that Chris is talking of, is it? I hear what you say about the general election, but it's not either A, do you like the terms of the deal, or B, do you want to revisit your decision about the referendum? It was a general election, not quite the same.
Oh, the general election was voting for parties that had made it clear they were going to implement the result of the referendum, and the 2 parties that didn't do that, the Greens and the Lib Dems, lost votes. It was quite clear from the general election and from the election campaign that delivering on Brexit had very widespread support, as opinion polling still shows.
Do you think that were Britain to go to the polls tomorrow, Britain would still vote Brexit?
Oh, I think if we had a second referendum, it would be on a different issue. It would be on the issue of democracy. Or are we some small country that gets bullied by the European Union into voting again and again until we do what we're told? And I think that's undemocratic, and I think it's simply not how the British people would expect to behave.
Chris, response from you?
Well, I mean, there's still lies being told. On the 27th of February at 5 p.m, Jacob, you tweeted an article from The Sun about consumer savings from leaving the European Union. The Sun has categorically admitted it was full of lies. James O'Brien has called you out on it. So why have you not done the same and retracted or deleted that tweet?
Well, look, I accept there were some errors in their figures, but the broad principle is right, that there are very high tariffs on food, clothing and footwear coming from the European Union. I noted, even when I tweeted it, that there was a mistake in relation to the savings they were proposing on tobacco. But the broad principle is absolutely true.
Why would you retweet a mistake, Mr. Rees-Mogg?
Because the broad principle is right.
Goodness me. Really? Is that enough to defend it?
Oh, yes. And you're taking Twitter as...
Your late father, the great editor of the Times, do you think he'd have run an article that was basically right, but a few facts were wrong?
No, come on.
Of course he wouldn't.
An article in the Times is a different level of seriousness from something that is tweeted.
Yes.
Twitter is passing on gobbets of information that may be of interest to people.
And this
was an interesting gobbet, which was, in its broad principle, absolutely right.
That can be wholly false.
That there are big savings to be made from leaving the European Union on food, clothing and footwear because of the very high tariffs we impose.
But they can't. You tweet on or on fake news.
No, not at all. The principle. No, come on.
You saw something. You agreed that it was wrong, but you decided to tweet it anyway.
Well, I noted in the tweet that I didn't think the savings on tobacco were realistic, or words to that effect.
Right.
But the broad principle is a really important one.
Right. You're not disseminating fake news, Mr. Rees-Mogg.
No, of course I'm not.
Quick last response, Chris.
Well, that is frankly ridiculous. I mean, to say that not people understood, there was 3,000 people retweeted that. There was one piece that was particularly interesting about flat screen TVs. You know as well as I do, Jacob, we have a free trade agreement via Europe with Korea, South Korea, which means that there will be no savings on flat screen television. I mean, it's just absolutely absurd what you're saying.
Depends which country they come from.
Right.
But the biggest savings are on food, clothing and footwear, as I've said consistently. The average tariff on food is 23%. In addition, there are non-tariff barriers. And this simply makes food more expensive in this country, which hits the least well off the most. And a lot of it is to protect continental businesses, why should the British consumer pay to protect continental businesses? There's no point in this. These savings are real. They will come through.
Thank you for that, Chris. We're moving to the last minute. A couple of questions from me. Should Alan Banks and others be allowed to join or, in some instances, rejoin the Conservative Party, Mr Rees-Mogg?
Well, I think people who change party can be very welcome. There is more joy in heaven over the one sinner who repenteth than the 99 who are not in need of repentance. But entryism is something that should be taken seriously. Now, the Tory party has welcomed members who used to be socialists. It's welcomed people from the SDP, including, I think, 2 cabinet ministers used to be SDP members. But I think you'd have to be careful about somebody who wants to organise an infiltration of the party.
How would you work that out, though? That's the problem, isn't it? The Trojan horse.
The Trojan horse. I think entryism in the Conservative Party is unlikely, partly because of the structure of our membership, partly because the membership, although not as large as it used to be, is still quite large. We're talking about 125,000 members. You'd have to get a huge number to join to be able to take control. And what are you taking control of? The only thing you get is a vote in a leadership election, which isn't in the offing. You don't get to make policy or elect the National Executive Committee or any of those sorts of things. The Tory party is not like the Labour Party. It's locally based, so your entryism would only involve you in the local party rather than in national decision-making.
We've talked a lot about the current Governor of the Bank of England. A former Governor, Lord King, says Brexit preparedness is incompetent and some of it beggared belief. Jacob Rees-Mogg, is he right?
Well, I think he's somebody that one would listen to very seriously. He's a very distinguished former governor, and he's raised some important concerns about the lateness of the preparation for leaving on WTO terms and the way the negotiations have been carried out. I share some of those concerns.
And lastly, Archbishop of Canterbury, I appreciate you're a supporter of the other side in a way, but the Archbishop of Canterbury is suggesting a major change in how we tax, a £9 billion inheritance super tax, increases in capital gains, in corporation tax. A word from you.
I think it's better if archbishops talk about God and politicians talk about politics.
But if he sees some of his flock suffering, is it not his duty to speak up and say how they might in some way be helped?
Render unto Caesar what is to Caesar, and render unto God what is to God.
OK. I tried. Let's move on to other matters. Farewell, Alistair Cook.
Yes, I know.
The
Isn't
batting lineup.
what a hero of British cricket he's been.
Is he one of the greats?
Oh, he must be. I mean, the highest run scorer for England.
Is he one of your own, in your all-time England 11?
Gosh, that's...
Is he next to Mr. Boycott? Does he even make the top? Does he make the opening slot?
That's such a difficult question, and I've been reading about W.G. Grace.
Yes,
who
indeed.
Definitely makes the team, and is probably captain. And when you look at his figures...
Is this Grace or Cook?
Grace.
Yeah.
They don't really compare with modern cricketers because he was playing on much worse pitches, they weren't covered, and he was quite remarkable against his contemporaries.
Yes.
And so it's hard to make these historic comparisons, but Cook is one of the greats. His record is terrific. But also, not that I know him or have ever met him, but he's got a deeply attractive public personality.
Yeah.
He comes across incredibly well. Studious, good captain, a fair, honourable player, absolute model for what cricket ought to be. So I'm a fully paid up admirer of his.
Do you think we've got it the wrong way round, Jacob? Carney's staying and Cook's going. Shouldn't it be the other way around, you think?
Well, perhaps Alistair Cook should be Governor of the Bank of England. I think he'd be better at being Governor of the Bank of England than Mr. Carney would be at opening the batting.
I think even Mark Carney would agree with that. Jacob Rees-Mogg appearing with Ring Rees-Mogg here on LBC 9:32 News. Simon Conway.
Jacob Rees-Mogg has told LBC he doesn't think the Bank of England Governor Mark Carney's term in office should be extended. Mr. Carney's confirmed he's in discussions with the Treasury on staying beyond